The locksmith held my front door key between two fingers and looked from the brass tag to the people standing inside my living room. Before I make another copy, he said carefully, I need to ask something. Are you the owner of this property? My mother-in-law, Diane, stopped folding one of my blankets. My father-in-law, Robert, slowly lowered the coffee mug he had been holding. Neither of them answered. I was standing on my own porch at 7:15 in the morning, still wearing my Navy hospital scrubs after a 12-hour overnight shift, watching strangers act like they had always belonged inside the house I spent 8 years paying for. The strange part was not that my in-laws were there. The strange part was that they had changed the locks, and they had done it while I was working. I still remember the small silver envelope sitting on my kitchen counter that morning. My name was written on it in Diane's handwriting, but the note inside wasn't an apology or an explanation. It was a list of household expectations for me. The woman who had entered my home without permission had somehow decided I needed rules for living there. I didn't know then that a tiny mistake on a locksmith's invoice would eventually reveal the truth about why they moved in, what they believed they were entitled to, and why I had spent years confusing being needed with being loved. If you have ever felt like your kindness became an invitation for someone else to take control, stay with me. This story may feel more familiar than you expect. My name is Laura Bennett, and I was 39 years old when I learned that the hardest locks to change are not always the ones on your doors. I worked as an emergency room nurse in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. My schedule was unpredictable, but I had built a life around it. My husband, Mark, and I bought our 3-bedroom house in 2018 after saving every extra dollar we could. It was not a huge house. The kitchen cabinets were outdated, the basement flooded once every spring, and the upstairs bathroom had tiles that never matched because we replaced them one section at a time. But it was ours. Or at least I thought it was. Mark had always been close to his parents. Diane and Robert lived about 40 minutes away in a quiet retirement community. They were the kind of people who looked generous from the outside. They brought casseroles when someone was sick, remembered birthdays, and offered advice before anyone asked. But over the years, I noticed something. Their help always came with invisible strings attached. When they gave us furniture for our first apartment, Diane reminded me several times that family things should stay in the family. When we bought our house, Robert joked that they had helped create the foundation, even though their contribution was a $500 gift toward closing costs. I laughed at the time. I shouldn't have, because years later, that same sentence would become the reason they believed they had a claim over a house they never owned. And the first warning sign came on a Tuesday morning when I walked through my front door after another exhausting night shift and found 3 unfamiliar suitcases lined up against my hallway wall. The first thing I noticed was not the suitcases, it was the photograph. A framed picture of Mark's parents from their 25th anniversary had been placed on the bookshelf in my living room, directly in front of a small ceramic house that my grandmother had given me before she passed away. The ceramic house had a crack running down one side, but I kept it because my grandmother always told me, a repaired thing can still hold memories. Diane had moved it, not thrown it away, not broken it, moved it. That somehow bothered me more, because it meant she had already started making decisions. I stood there in my kitchen, still holding my overnight bag, waiting for Mark to explain why his parents' belongings were spread throughout my home. He walked in from the hallway carrying another box. "Laura," he said quietly, "before you get upset, just hear me out." That sentence was something I had heard many times during my marriage, usually right before I was expected to accept something I had never agreed to. I placed my bag on the floor. "Why are your parents here?" Mark looked tired, not guilty exactly. More like someone who had already decided the conversation was difficult and hoped I would make it easier. They had some problems with their condo. What kind of problems? Their mortgage payment increased. Robert's retirement account took a hit. They're stressed. I looked toward the hallway. How long are they staying? Mark hesitated. That hesitation answered before he did. Just temporarily. How temporary, Laura? Mark, he sighed. 8 months. That phrase has a way of sounding harmless until you realize nobody has defined it. I looked around the house I had spent years maintaining while working nights. The walls I painted myself. The kitchen table I found at a thrift store and restored on my days off. The small office where I paid every bill and organized every document. Now 2 people had entered my home, and somehow I was the one standing there feeling like a guest. Diane appeared from the hallway with a smile. "Oh good, you're home." There was something strange about the way she said it. Not "you're finally home," not "you must be exhausted," just "you're home." Like she was confirming my arrival at a place she already occupied. "I hope you don't mind," she said, walking toward the kitchen, "but I rearranged a few things. Your pantry system was a little inefficient." I stared at her. "My pantry system?" She opened the cabinet beside the refrigerator. I grouped everything by category. Baking, canned goods, breakfast items. It makes more sense. I had spent years organizing that pantry because I cooked most of our meals between shifts. I knew exactly where everything was. But Diane had changed it within hours, something so small, something so easy to dismiss. And yet it told me exactly how she saw herself, not as a visitor, as someone who was improving my home. I wish you had asked first, I said. The room went quiet. Diane blinked. I was just trying to help. That was the phrase she used whenever someone objected. Help. It was difficult to argue with help, because refusing it made you seem ungrateful. Mark stepped between us. Mom didn't mean anything by it. I looked at him. That's the problem, Mark. Everyone keeps deciding what things mean without asking me. He looked away. That hurt more than Diane's rearranged pantry, because I had spent years protecting Mark from conflict with his parents. I knew Diane could be overwhelming. I knew Robert avoided difficult conversations. I knew Mark had grown up believing peace meant someone staying quiet, and somehow that someone was always me. I was the one who apologized first. I was the one who adjusted. I was the one who said it's fine, even when it wasn't. Growing up, I had been the responsible child. My younger brother, Evan, was the one who needed attention. He struggled in school, changed jobs often, and made decisions that worried my parents. I became the easy one, the reliable one, the person everyone called when something needed fixing. At first, I felt proud of that. Being dependable felt like being valuable. But somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing the difference between being loved and being useful. And Mark knew that about me. Maybe that was why he believed I would eventually accept his parents moving in. Because I always had. 3 days later, I found another change. The spare bedroom closet. That room had never been a guest room to me. It was where I kept old medical textbooks, my grandmother's things, winter clothes, and boxes of memories I wasn't ready to sort through. When I opened the door after work, everything was gone. Not organized. Gone. My boxes were stacked in the basement. Diane's clothes filled the closet. I walked downstairs holding one of my old boxes. Where are my things? She looked up from the couch. Oh, I moved them. You hardly use that room. I felt my chest tighten. I used that room. Laura, you have an entire basement. That doesn't mean you can move my belongings. Her expression changed slightly. Not anger, offense. Like I had accused her of something unreasonable. I'm sorry you feel that way. That sentence stayed with me, because it wasn't an apology. It was a way of saying my feelings were the problem. That night, after another 12-hour shift, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. I wasn't searching for revenge. I wasn't planning a fight. I was simply trying to understand what had happened to my own home. And that was when I noticed something odd. The property tax notification that had always come to my email had been marked as opened. Not by me, someone else had accessed my mail. And for the first time, I wondered whether my in-laws had only moved into my house, or whether they believed they had moved into something they could eventually control. The morning I discovered my mail had been opened, I did something I normally avoided. I confronted the problem immediately. That might sound simple, but for most of my life, I had been someone who waited. I waited until people calmed down. I waited until the timing was better. I waited until I could explain myself in a way that nobody could misunderstand. The problem with waiting is that people who benefit from your silence start believing your silence means permission. I printed the notification from the property tax website and carried it downstairs where Mark's parents were eating breakfast. Diane was reading a magazine. Robert was drinking coffee. Mark looked at me and immediately knew something was wrong. What happened? I placed the paper on the table. Someone accessed my property tax account yesterday. Mark picked it up. Maybe it was a mistake. It was opened from my email. Robert looked uncomfortable. Diane continued reading. That bothered me, not because I expected her to confess, because she looked completely calm. Did you check your email settings? Mark asked. Yes. Maybe your account was hacked. I looked at him. Mark, the only new people in this house are your parents. The silence that followed was heavier than an argument. Diane slowly lowered her magazine. Are you accusing us? I'm asking a question. No, you're making an accusation. Her voice was quiet, controlled. That was something I had learned about Diane over the years. She rarely raised her voice. She didn't need to. She could make a conversation feel like a courtroom without ever saying anything aggressive. Robert cleared his throat. Laura, we're family. Why would we do something like that? I looked at him. I wanted to believe him. I really did. That was hardest part. People often imagine betrayal comes from someone you never trusted. But sometimes it comes from someone you spent years defending. I don't know, I says. And that was the truth. I didn't had changed. Later that afternoon, while Mark was at work, I searched through the house. Not because I wanted to invade anyone's privacy. Because I needed to know what was happening inside my own walls. In the kitchen drawer where I kept spare keys, I found something missing. The key to the basement door. I had never thought much about that key because it stayed with the others. A small brass key attached to a faded blue tag. I asked Diane about it when she returned from grocery shopping. Did you take the basement key? She looked confused. The basement key? The one from the kitchen drawer. Oh. She set the grocery bags down. Robert needed it. For what? He wanted to check the furnace. I looked toward the basement door. You could have asked me, Diane sighed. Laura, we are staying here. We need to be able to access. There it was, that word. Staying, not visiting, not living temporarily, staying, like the arrangement already had rules. I need boundaries, I said. She stared at me. Boundaries? Yes. She gave a small laugh, not a mocking laugh, a disappointed one. Mark told me you might struggle with this. My stomach dropped. What does that mean? She avoided my eyes. I just mean you've always been very independent. It sounded like a compliment. But it wasn't. It meant difficult, uncooperative, not willing to bend. That evening, I waited for Mark to come home. I needed him to understand that this was no longer about his parents needing help. This was about my home becoming a place where my permission was optional. When he walked through the door, I was sitting at this kitchen table with the ceramic house my grandmother gave me beside my laptop. He looked at it. Why is that out? Because I'm trying to remember something. What? That a house is not just walls. He sat down. Laura, please listen. I opened my property records. I bought this house before we got married. I know. I paid the down payment. I know. My name is on the deed. I know. Then why are your parents making decisions like they own it? Mark rubbed his forehead. They're scared. I understand that. They lost security. I understand that too. Then why are you acting like they're criminals? I looked at him. Because that was the question he wanted answered. Not why I felt uncomfortable. Why I was making him uncomfortable. I'm not saying they're criminals. I'm saying I need my husband to recognize when something is wrong. He was quiet. Then he said something I would remember for a long time. They don't see it as your house. I felt my hands go cold. What? They see as the family house. I stared at him. There are moments when a sentence changes the entire shape of a problem. Because suddenly you realize you have been arguing about the wrong thing. I thought my in-laws believed they had the right to rearrange my pantry, to move my belongings, to open my mail. But maybe the deeper issue was something else. Maybe they believed my independence was temporary. Maybe they believed everything I built was still somehow available to them. The next morning, I woke up after a night shift and found a handwritten note taped to my bedroom door. It was from Diane. Inside were 5 rules. Keep shared spaces cleaner. Ask before making major purchases. Coordinate meals with the household. Let Robert handle home repairs. Respect everyone's needs. I read it twice. Then I turned it over. On the back was a sentence that made my decision for me. We all have to adjust now that this is a shared home. I stood there in my hallway, exhausted, holding a note written by someone who had entered my house without permission and was now asking me to adapt to her rules. That was the moment I stopped wondering how to make everyone comfortable and started asking myself a different question. How long was I willing to disappear inside my own life? For 2 days, I said almost nothing. Not because I had accepted what was happening, because I was finally paying attention. There is a difference between being quiet because you are afraid and being quiet because you are gathering information. For years, I had reacted emotionally whenever Diane pushed too far. I would explain, defend, and try to prove I wasn't being unreasonable. But this time I watched. I watched who made decisions. I watched who apologized. I watched who expected me to adjust. And I started noticing things I had ignored before. Like how Robert stopped asking me before touching things around the house. Like how Diane began introducing rooms as if they belonged to her. The office needs better lighting. The living room furniture arrangement makes more sense this way. The guest bathroom should become Robert's bathroom. Small sentences, small changes. But each one carried the same message. We are not guests. We are becoming permanent. The breaking point came on a Friday morning when I returned home from work and found a contractor's truck parked outside my driveway. At first, I assumed something had happened. Maybe a pipe broke. Maybe the furnace failed. But when I walked inside, I saw Robert standing near the basement stairs with a man holding a clipboard. Robert? He turned around. Oh, Laura, you're home. I looked at the stranger. Who is this? This is Dave. He's giving me an estimate. For what? Robert looked surprised that I asked. The basement. I stared at him. What about the basement? We're thinking about finishing it. The word we hit me immediately. We? Robert looked uncomfortable. Your parents and I talked about making the house more comfortable. My parents? Diane stepped out of the kitchen. We thought it would add value. I looked at her. Who is paying for this? Nobody answered. And that silence told me enough. I turned to Mark. He had just walked in from the garage. You knew about this? His face changed, only slightly, but enough. I knew they wanted to discuss improvements. Improvements? I pointed toward the basement. They are planning renovations in my house while I'm working nights. Mark sighed. Laura, nobody is trying to hurt you. Again, that phrase. Nobody is trying to hurt you. As if intentions were the only thing that mattered. I looked at the contractor. I'm sorry, but there will be no work done until I approve it. The man immediately stepped back. I understand. Robert's expression hardened. Laura, we're trying to help. No, my voice surprised even me. Not loud, not angry. Just clear. You're making decisions. Nobody spoke. That evening, after everyone went to bed, I went downstairs to the basement. I needed to understand why Robert was suddenly interested in renovations. The furnace room was crowded with boxes. Most belonged to my in-laws. As I moved a stack of old manuals, something fell behind them. A brown folder. My name was written on the front, Laura Bennett. I froze. I had never seen it before. Inside were copies of documents, my property tax records, a copy of my mortgage statement, a printed page from the county property website, and something else. A spreadsheet. I sat down on the basement floor and read through it. At first, I thought it was a budget. Then I realized what it was. A plan. A monthly expense breakdown comparing their retirement income to my household costs, electricity, water, insurance, property taxes, groceries, even my estimated home maintenance expenses. At the bottom was a handwritten note. Better arrangement if Laura and Mark allow shared ownership. I read that sentence several times. Shared ownership. The words felt unreal. Because they weren't asking to live with us. They were trying to justify why they should have a claim. I took pictures of every page. Then I heard footsteps. I quickly closed the folder. Robert stood at the basement entrance. He looked down at me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "You weren't supposed to see that." My heart started beating faster. Not because I was scared. Because I finally had confirmation. "What is it, Robert?" He looked away. "Your mother-in-law was just trying to figure out options." "Options for what?" He didn't answer. "Why did you have my financial information?" His jaw tightened. "We needed to know if the house could support everyone." I stood up. "Everyone?" He sighed. "Laura, you have a good job. You have stability. We thought this was the sensible solution." There it was. The belief underneath everything. My success had become a resource. My responsibility had become an expectation. I carried the folder upstairs and locked it in my bedroom. That night I didn't sleep, not because I was afraid of losing my house. I wasn't. The deed was clear. The mortgage was clear. The facts were clear. What hurt was realizing that people I had welcomed into my life had been quietly planning a future that required me to give up pieces of myself. The next morning, I made an appointment with someone who had helped me years earlier when I bought the house. A real estate attorney named Claire Donovan. I didn't call her because I wanted a battle. I called her because I needed to know my options. And before I left for my appointment, I placed the old ceramic house from my grandmother back on the bookshelf. But this time, I moved it to the center, not because it was fragile, because I finally understood what it represented. Something repaired was not the same as something available for everyone to take apart. I expected the meeting with Claire Donovan to make me angry. Instead, it made me tired. Not the kind of tired that comes after a long hospital shift. The deeper kind. The kind that comes from realizing you have spent years carrying something that was never actually yours to carry. Claire's office was above a small independent bookstore on the main street in town. The building was old, with narrow wooden stairs and windows that looked over the sidewalk below. I remember noticing the details because my nursing brain always searched for signs of order. A neatly organized desk, files labeled by year, a small plant sitting near the window. Everything had a place. I liked that. Maybe because my own home suddenly felt like everything was being moved around. Claire listened without interrupting. I showed her the pictures of the folder I found in the basement. She studied each one carefully. Then she looked at me. "Laura, the first thing I want you to know is that you are not wrong for wanting control over your own property." I nodded. I know, but I didn't fully know, not emotionally. Because somewhere inside me, I was still searching for permission to be upset. Claire explained things simply. The deed was in my name. My in-laws had no ownership interest. Living in the house did not create ownership. But she also warned me that family situations were complicated. "Your biggest challenge may not be legal," she said. "What is it?" "Getting everyone to accept that your boundary is real." That sentence stayed with me, because she was right. The problem was never that I didn't know where the line was. The problem was that I had spent years moving the line whenever someone complained. Claire suggested something practical. Start documenting everything. Everything? Dates. Conversations. Changes made to the property. Expenses. Requests. I almost laughed. It sounded like something I would tell a patient's family during a difficult medical situation. Write things down. Be specific. Don't rely on memory when emotions are high. I had spent years telling other people to do exactly that. Now I had to do it for myself. When I got home, I created a folder on my computer. I named it Home Records. It felt strange, almost cold, like I was turning my family into a case file. But then I remembered the folder I found behind the furnace manual. Someone else had already done that. They had just done it without my knowledge. That evening, I made another decision. I would stop paying for things silently. For years, I handled most household expenses because I earned more than Mark. It wasn't something we fought about. I simply covered what needed covering. Groceries, repairs, insurance increases, unexpected bills. I told myself that was what partners did. But now I wondered if I had accidentally trained everyone around me to believe my resources were unlimited. So I sat down with Mark. "We need to talk about finances." He looked nervous. About my parents? About our household. I opened a spreadsheet, not the one Diane created. Mine. Clear. Simple. From now on, we need a written agreement about expenses while your parents are living here. Mark looked uncomfortable. Laura, that feels extreme, does it? He didn't answer. I continued. I'm not asking them to pay rent. I'm asking us to be honest about what this arrangement costs. Mark leaned back. My parents are already embarrassed. I understand. Then why are you making this harder? I looked at him. Because making things easier has always meant making them easier for everyone except me. He became quiet. That was the first time I saw him actually hear me. Not agree, not defend, hear me. But change did not happen overnight. The next week, Diane found out I had met with Claire. She confronted me while I was preparing dinner. You got legal advice? I turned around. Yes, her face fell. About us? About my house. She crossed her arms. That's hurtful. I almost responded the old way. I almost apologized. Instead, I asked why. She looked surprised. Because you're treating family like strangers. No, I said. I'm treating my property like my responsibility. That was the first time I had spoken to her without trying to soften every word. She walked away. And for the rest of the evening, nobody spoke to me. The silence was uncomfortable. But something strange happened. I survived it. I had spent years fearing disappointment from other people. But disappointment did not destroy me. A few days later, I made another mistake. I thought if I explained everything calmly enough, everyone would understand. So I prepared a family meeting. I printed the expenses, I wrote down boundaries, I planned every sentence, but I underestimated one thing. People who are comfortable with your sacrifice rarely accept your boundaries the first time you introduce them. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. Diane said I was being formal. Robert said I was forgetting family values. Mark said he felt caught in the middle, and I sat there realizing something painful. I had spent so much time trying to make everyone understand my position that I had forgotten something important. Understanding was not required for a boundary to exist. The next morning, I arrived home after another night shift and found an envelope on the kitchen counter. My name was written on it. Inside was a letter from a company I had never heard of, a home valuation request. Someone had scheduled an appointment for my property, and the signature at the bottom was not mine. The valuation company's letter was dated May 14. The appointment was scheduled for the following Monday at 10 in the morning, precisely when I would normally be asleep after working Sunday night. I read the page 3 times before calling the number at the top. A woman named Marisol answered. I need to confirm who requested an appraisal of my property, I said. She asked for the address, then paused. The request came from Robert Bennett. That is my father-in-law. He identified himself as an authorized family representative. My grip tightened around the phone. Did he provide ownership documents? No. This was only a preliminary valuation. We would require the legal owner's authorization before entering the property. I looked toward the hallway. Robert's shoes were by the front door. He was home. Cancel it, I said. No one has permission to inspect the house. When I ended the call, I added the letter to my home records folder and photographed the envelope. Then I made a choice that felt both sensible and humiliating. I installed a small security camera inside my office, not in the bedrooms, not in shared spaces, only above the filing cabinet where I kept the deed, tax records, and insurance documents. For 2 nights, nothing happened. On the third, the motion alert woke me at 2:18 in the afternoon. I watched the video from my bed. Diane entered my office carrying the spare brass key from the kitchen drawer. She opened the filing cabinet. She removed my mortgage folder. And then Mark walked in behind her. I stopped breathing. He did not look surprised. He closed the office door. The video had no audio, but I did not need it. Diane pointed to several pages. Mark shook his head. She pushed the folder toward him. He took photographs with his phone. I replayed those 12 seconds until the screen blurred. The betrayal was no longer just his parents. That evening, I waited until Mark came home. I placed the brass key, the valuation letter, and a printed image from the camera on the kitchen table. He stared at the photograph. You put a camera in the house? In my private office. That's unbelievable. I almost admired how quickly he moved from being caught to feeling violated. Why were you photographing my mortgage documents? His face hardened. My parents needed to understand the numbers. For what? He rubbed both hands over his face. They're underwater on the condo. They owe more than they can sell it for. Dad thought if they contributed to renovations here, maybe we could refinance later and put them on the title. I felt something inside me become very still. You discussed adding them to my deed. We discussed options. No, you discussed my property. His voice rose slightly. They're my parents, Laura, and this is my house. He looked at the table, then at me. For once, I did not rescue him from the silence. I slid the brass key toward him. Your parents have 30 days to leave. His chair scraped the floor. You can't just decide that. I met his eyes. I just did. The following afternoon, Diane called a locksmith. She told him the front lock was unreliable and asked him to make additional keys before I returned from work. What she did not know was that the locksmith had serviced this house before. He remembered my name from the invoice. And when I pulled into the driveway at sunrise, he was standing on my porch asking the question no one inside wanted to answer. Which one of you is the owner? The locksmith's name was Calvin Reese. He stood on my porch, holding a work order, while Diane remained just inside the doorway, one hand resting on the new deadbolt box she had purchased. She told me the property owner approved the change, he said. I am the property owner. Calvin looked at Diane. Her face had lost its practiced calm. There has been a misunderstanding, she said. No, I replied. There has been a pattern. Robert stepped forward. Laura, let's not make a scene in front of a stranger. Calvin lowered his clipboard. I haven't changed anything, he said. And I won't without written authorization from the deed holder. He handed me the work order. Diane had listed herself as resident manager. I folded the page once and placed it in my bag. Thank you for checking. After Calvin left, Mark closed the front door. You embarrassed my mother. I stared at him. She tried to alter the locks on my house. She wanted extra keys. She already had a key. Diane's voice softened. We were afraid you would lock us out. That sentence should have made me angry. Instead, it exposed her. She knew she had crossed a line. She knew the 30-day deadline was real. And beneath all her control was a woman terrified of having nowhere secure to go. Robert sat down slowly. Their condo problem was worse than Mark had admitted. They had missed 2 mortgage payments. Robert had withdrawn money from his retirement account to cover an investment loss he had hidden from Diane. The penalties and interest had left them with barely enough income for rent. For the first time, Diane did not sound commanding. She sounded frightened. I spent 38 years making a home, she said. Now every place we can afford feels temporary. I understood that fear. A home is where you expect your belongings to remain where you left them, where a key means safety, where nobody can remove you because your usefulness has expired. Her fear explained her behavior. It did not excuse it. Mark asked me to extend the deadline to 6 months. For one dangerous moment, I considered it. I imagined Diane in a small apartment with secondhand furniture, Robert learning to live with what his pride had cost them, Mark looking at me as the woman who forced his parents out. Then Diane reached for the silver envelope still sitting near the fruit bowl. We could start over, she said, with clearer expectations. She slid her household rules toward me as though the problem had been poor communication. I looked at the paper, then at the suitcase beside the stairs. It was mine. Mark had packed it. Thought I was leaving? I asked. He did not answer. That silence settled the question. They had not feared losing a home. They had assumed they could keep mine by pushing me out of it. I tore the household rules once, neatly down the center. The deadline stays. Diane closed her eyes. Mark shook his head, and I picked up my suitcase, not to leave, but to carry it back upstairs. For the first time, the person being displaced in that house would not be me. The 30 days did not pass quietly. Diane stopped rearranging the house, but her restraint felt temporary, like a person waiting for someone else to weaken first. Robert spent most mornings at the kitchen table studying rental listings. He crossed out every apartment with stairs, every neighborhood more than 15 minutes from Mark, and every monthly payment above $100. At night, I heard him and Diane arguing behind the guest room door. You said the investment was safe. I said it had potential. You used our retirement, Robert. Their voices stayed low, but low voices travel clearly through walls when a family has stopped pretending. Mark barely spoke to me. He slept on the couch and communicated through practical questions. Are you working tonight? Did the electric bill come? Can my parents use the storage bins in the garage? He behaved as though our marriage had become a scheduling problem. On the 23rd day, Claire called. I received an email from an attorney representing Robert and Diane. My stomach tightened. What do they want? They claim they contributed to the property and relied on promises that they could remain there. What contributions? The $500 they gave you at closing, some recent grocery purchases, and Robert's unpaid repair work. I almost laughed, but Claire did not. They're asking for mediation before the deadline. Can they take my house? Based on what you've shown me, their ownership claim appears weak. But mediation may help document the move-out terms and prevent further accusations. I agreed. Not because I believed they deserved negotiation over my property, because I wanted the next decision recorded clearly enough that nobody could rewrite it later. The mediation was scheduled at Claire's office. Before we left, I opened my filing cabinet and removed the deed, the original closing statement, the locksmith's work order, the valuation letter, and photographs of the folder from the basement. Then I noticed the ceramic house on my bookshelf. The crack along its side had collected dust. I wiped it clean and placed it in the center of the empty guest room closet. Mark stood in the doorway. You're making this permanent, he said. No, I replied. Your choices did that. His face changed. For 1 second, he looked less like a husband defending his parents and more like the boy Diane had trained to prevent every consequence. She'll never forgive me if I don't support her. I closed the folder. And you believed I always would. He looked down. That was the quietest moment we had shared in weeks. At Claire's office, Diane sat beside her attorney with the silver envelope in her purse. Robert carried a handwritten ledger of every faucet washer, furnace filter, and grocery bag he claimed to have purchased. Mark sat between them and me. Claire arranged my documents across the closing table, the same kind of table where I had signed for the house 8 years earlier. Diane placed her hand over Mark's. Then she looked directly at me. We only need you to acknowledge what this family has invested. I opened the deed. I intend to acknowledge exactly that. And for the first time, Mark moved his chair away from his mother's hand. Claire began with Robert's ledger. He had recorded every expense in blue ink. $34 for furnace filters, $87 for groceries, $12 for a replacement shower head. Beside several entries, he had written, labor no charge. His attorney slid the notebook across the table. These contributions demonstrate that my clients treated the property as their permanent home. I turned to Robert. Did I ask you to replace the shower head? He shifted in his chair. No, but it was leaking. Did I approve the contractor estimate for the basement? No. Did I promise you ownership in exchange for repairs? His fingers tightened around his pen. Mark said we would figure something out. Every face turned toward my husband. Mark stared at the table. Diane spoke before he could. He told us this would eventually become a shared family property. The room became very quiet. I did not look away from Mark. Did you promise them part of my house? He swallowed. I told them I thought you could be persuaded. Not asked, persuaded. Claire placed the valuation letter beside the security camera image. Then she added the locksmith's work order, where Diane had described herself as the resident manager. This is not evidence of a reasonable belief in ownership, Claire said. It is evidence that decisions were being made without the legal owner's authorization. Diane reached into her purse and removed the silver envelope. She unfolded her household rules and smoothed the torn halves together on the table. We were trying to create stability. I looked at those rules, the pantry instructions, the demand that Robert control repairs, the expectation that I ask permission before spending my own money. No, I said. You were trying to make my independence feel like disobedience. Diane's mouth tightened. Robert stared at his ledger. Mark whispers, Laura, they have nowhere to go. Claire had already helped me prepare for that. I slid a printed apartment listing across the table. It was a modest 2-bedroom unit 28 minutes away, within their verified monthly budget. The landlord had agreed to hold it for 48 hours if they submitted the deposit. I'm not leaving you homeless, I said. I'm refusing to surrender my home. Diane looked at the listing but did not touch it. And what happens to Mark? That was the question beneath every other question. She expected him to choose her. For years, so did he. I turned to my husband. You packed my suitcase, you entered my locked office, you discussed my deed as though I were an obstacle. Whether you stay in this marriage is your decision. Whether your parents remain in my house is not. Mark's eyes filled, but he did not argue. He removed his house key from his ring and placed it beside the deed. I need time, he said. I nodded. Take it somewhere else. The mediation agreement gave Robert and Diane 7 days to move into the apartment. In return, I agreed not to pursue reimbursement for the unauthorized valuation or the locksmith visit. They formally acknowledged that they had no ownership claim. Robert signed first. Diane held the pen for nearly a minute. Then she signed without looking at me. As we stood to leave, she reached for the silver envelope. I placed my hand over it. No, I said calmly. Those rules stay with the owner. She released it. The locksmith had asked them who owned the house. At the closing table, I finally answered for myself. Robert and Diane moved out 6 days later. The apartment was smaller than the home they had imagined claiming, but it was clean, accessible, and theirs under a 12-month lease. Robert sold his remaining investment shares at a loss and took a part-time job managing inventory at a hardware store. Diane never thanked me for finding the apartment. She did, however, stop calling my house the family home. For the first 3 months, we had no contact. Mark stayed with a coworker and began counseling on his own. I filed for legal separation, not because I wanted to punish him, but because love could not repair what he still refused to name. He had not simply failed to defend me. He had helped other people plan around my consent. 6 months later, we met at a quiet cafe. He looked older. My mother taught me that disappointing her meant abandoning her, he said. But I made you pay for that fear. It was the first apology he gave without asking me to reduce the consequence. We did not immediately reconcile. Trust did not return because he finally understood why it had disappeared. We spent nearly a year living separately. Mark paid his share of our joint debts, attended counseling, and stopped carrying messages between me and his parents. When Diane asked him to pressure me into changing the separation agreement, he told her, Laura's boundary is not mine to negotiate. That sentence mattered more than flowers would have. Eventually, Mark and I chose to rebuild our marriage slowly, with separate finances and written agreements about the house. His name did not go on the deed. He accepted that without argument. My contact with Robert and Diane remained limited. We met for lunch on birthdays. They were never given another key. The silver envelope stayed in my office for several months. One afternoon, I opened it, read the household rules one final time, and fed both torn halves through the shredder. I kept Calvin's locksmith invoice, not as evidence, as a reminder. The brass key with the faded blue tag now hangs inside a small frame beside my desk. Beneath it, I placed a handwritten card. Permission is not cruelty. The ceramic house returned to the bookshelf. I repaired the crack with a thin line of gold-colored resin, not to hide the damage, but to show where pressure had once split it. I used to believe strength meant keeping everyone inside no matter what they changed, moved, or took. Now I understand that a home is not measured by how many people you allow through the door. It is measured by whether you are still allowed to belong there as yourself. If someone in your family has mistaken your kindness for ownership, tell me in the comments what boundary you wish you had set sooner. And subscribe for more stories about women who stopped surrendering the keys to their own lives.